Hey, what's up everybody? This is Monster Zero and welcome back to my channel. Today we have a very special brand new headphone, the very first proprietary planar magnetic headphone from ZMF. This is the Caldera. It has a sensitivity of 95 and approximately 60 ohms. The introductory wood type is this one, which is white oak, and it retails initially for $3,200, and then it jumps up to $35,000. And then the first limited wood is going to be king wood, which I've not seen before, but ZMF has sent me some photos, and I'll get those edited into this video as soon as I can. That is going to be $35,000. Don't quote me on that. And then the full price after the initial release will be $4,000. So the fit and finish of the Caldera is like all of the other ZMF headphones. They are handmade in Chicago. They have solid wood cups with a slightly concave grill. I don't know if you can see that there. And then in each cup, you've got 3 ports in the front. 2 ports, I don't know if you can see that, on the back end of it. And there are no two alike aesthetically. You know, the wood grain is different on every single pair, so each one that you get is one of one. The ear pads are a new design. They are called the Caldera pads, and these are interesting pads. They're quite thick, as you can see. But what makes them interesting is they kind of just perform like a suction onto your head. And if you can't get a good seal with these, you can't get a good seal with any pads. These things, you almost have to peel them off of your head when you're done listening. I mean, a very, very solid, tight seal. So I don't know how they did that, but excellent. As far as the comfort goes, like everything else that ZMF has released, I find these to be incredibly comfortable. They are quite heavy, but the suspension strap does a remarkable job of dispersing the weight across your entire head, and I listen in a recliner, so weight has never been an issue for me. But if it is for you, that is something to be considered. They're up close to or possibly over 500 grams, depending upon the chassis that you choose. So before we get into the actual review of the sound, let me go over briefly the methods I use. First of all, I use my Lampizator TRP DAC, which is a tube-based DAC, and that's important, and I'll explain why later. And then as far as amping goes, I used a solid-state amp, which is the Cayin IHA 6. And then I also used a transformer-coupled tube amp called the Aegis, which is a up-and-coming do-it-yourself amp that Lord Gwen has designed and allowed me to check out. I'm getting 2 very different presentations between the 2 amps. Additionally, because I've got tubes in my DAC, even though I could be using a solid-state amp, I'm still getting some of that tube fluidity, so keep that in mind when I'm describing the sound, because it might be a case of why MMV versus somebody who uses a solid-state DAC. The cable that I used in this review is a ZMF copper 2K cable, and I use that on all the other ZMFs that I did an A/B against. So the cables, the amps, the DAC, everything was uniform. So inside the Caldera, working the magic, you've got 2 different patented by ZMF things going on. You have the Atrium damping system, which we first heard with the Atrium, and then was followed up by the Auteur Classic. The Atrium damping system is present in the Caldera as well. And you also have a new design called CAMS, C-A-M-S, which is an acronym for Caldera Asymmetrical Magnet System. I think I got that right. So how that manifested itself, the magnets inside the Caldera are rounded or triangular in shape, and it allows the drivers to be more nodal, similar to a dynamic driver while still retaining the technicalities of a planar. Using the cams, it also allows better airflow and less signal blockage via the magnets, so the sound is more flowing. And then finally, they place the stronger magnets in the rear, which then offers better dynamics, better slam. So let's get into the sound, which is why I think everybody is tuning in today. We're going to start with the highs. Typically at this point in the video, I usually say that like most other ZMFs, the treble is gently rolled off, and I leave it at that. The Caldera is different. The treble is gently rolled off. However, it has an actual presence in this headphone, a noticeable presence. I'm used to listening to the various ZMF dynamics, and when I tried going through my music collection with the Caldera, I was surprised. I'm like, oh, there's a hi-hat in this song that I just haven't heard in years. So the treble is non-sibilant. I'm going to make that perfectly clear. We're not talking about a sibilant treble, but it is a present treble, and it's, in my opinion, quite enjoyable and a nice change, and I hope that in the future ZMF continues to give the treble region a little bit more presence like they have in the Caldera. The bottom end of the Caldera is very punchy. There's a lot of weight to the notes. It has a very thick sound. The sub bass, really nice, deep, extended sub bass. It is not overdone like perhaps the old pre-phaser LCD2 that had like ridiculous amounts of sub bass. The Sennheiser HD250, ridiculous amounts of sub bass. This doesn't have a bump in the sub bass to my ears, but it is very nicely extended all the way down. And then we come to the mid-range. Now this is where the headphone is different. You might have seen some people refer to the Caldera as hybrid sounding. And in my system and in my ears, it's in the mid-range. The mid-range is very warm and lush and flowing. Now, I mentioned that the CAMS magnet system is designed to help the music flow better. Similarly, I'm using, again, a tube-based DAC. So even when I'm using the Cayin solid-state amplifier, I'm still getting a lot of dynamic driver-like flow to the mids. The mids are not recessed, but they're not quite as forward as on the Atrium or on the Auteur or the Auteur Classic. But they're definitely more forward than on both of the Verites. The staging and the presentation is quite impressive. With the Atrium damping system, the presentation is very similar to the Atrium, similar to the Auteur Classic. So it has a 3D front, back, left, right, up, down sound. It isn't quite as wide as the Atrium. It's closer to my ears to the Auteur Classic as far as staging effects go. Now, when it comes to amping the Caldera, I think this is an important note to include in this video. A lot of ZMF owners have invested in an OTL amp, like myself. This would be the first ZMF headphone that differs from all the rest because it is a planar. I tried it on my AirMed OTL, which can get down to 30 ohm output with the right tubes. Even at 30 ohms, which is pretty low for an OTL, it didn't sound bad, but for a lack of a better term, and no pun certainly intended, it was kind of aired out, for a lack of a better term. The punchiness was gone, the weight and thickness and texture was not completely gone, but really diminished. So if you do have an OTL amp and that's your only amp, you're probably going to want to invest in another amp to drive the Caldera. I started a ZMF amplifier thread on HeadFi a couple weeks ago, and there's been a lot of great recommendations ranging from solid state through OTLs to transformer coupled all the way up to the 300B amps. Lots of great suggestions, and I'll be doing a couple more videos coming up very soon about a couple amps that I use with the Caldera, so you're going to want to tune in for that. So the Caldera clocks in at 60 ohms and 95 sensitivity, so it isn't particularly hard to drive. It just isn't a good match with an OTL amplifier. A couple early owners have been driving it with the Chord Mojo 2 and reporting great results. I use, like I said, the Cayin IHA 6, which is a super powerful amplifier, but you don't need gobs and gobs and gobs of power to drive the Caldera. Overall, I would say that the sound signature of the Caldera is quite balanced. There's no frequency that's over accentuated. Like I said, it's punchy. It's got deep diving sub bass. It's got a flowing, gorgeous mid-range. And then it has a very nice, subtle, detailed treble. Not a bass head headphone, and I've certainly heard headphones that hit harder. So I'm going to call this a very balanced sounding headphone to my ears. I did some A and Bs versus the Verite Open, the Atrium, the Auteur Classic, as well as with the Hifiman Susvara. I took some notes because I can't remember all this off the top of my head. Against the VO was warmer, with the mid-range more recessed, and surprisingly, it had a smaller stage on the amps that I tried than the Caldera. That one kind of surprised me. The Caldera was just snappier, and you know, the VO is a very fast sounding headphone, but this is snappier. Moving right along to the Atrium, another surprise. The Atrium was actually brighter sounding in my system than the Caldera. The Atrium had a larger stage with more mid-bass slam. And of course, the mid-range was more forward than on the Caldera. And then finally on the Auteur Classic, the Classic was brighter and the bass slam was less than on the Caldera. The staging was about the same, give or take, depending upon the song. Your mileage may vary depending upon the amp that you use. Now, as far as the Caldera sounds versus other planar magnetic headphones, I do have the Susvara here from Hifiman, which is a $6,000 headphone. It's a great sounding headphone, but the two are very different sounding. The Caldera is punchier, has more weight to the sound, whereas the Susvara just has this ginormous stage, and it's airier sounding, a lot more space in between what's going on in the song. The Susvara has this effortless quality to it where music just kind of appears out of nothing. It's just like, poof, it's there. I could see some genres where people would prefer the Susvara, perhaps classical maybe, perhaps jazz, but for rock, metal, I prefer the Caldera's punchier, thicker sound. I also briefly got to hear the Final Audio D8000, and while I didn't really get a chance to go back A and B, The few things that I did notice was that I much preferred the mid-range of the Caldera, as well as the staging of the Caldera. The staging was, again, more holographic, whereas the 8000 was more of a traditional left-right stage and certainly not as wide. The D8000 did have a punchier, it sounded like it had more mid-bass than the Caldera does. The Caldera does great with every genre of music that I've tried it with, rock, blues, metal, Americana, folk, trance, you name it, the Caldera rocks it. However, the Caldera isn't particularly kind to music that has less than great mastering or recording. So for you metalheads who listen to a lot of older metal that may not have the best production, the Caldera can be a little bit brutal with that stuff. I was having a private conversation with another member on HeadFi, and I mentioned that fact to him, and he was actually pleased. He's like, oh, I love to hear all the crappiness coming out of metal. I'm like, okay. So, you know, your mileage may vary on that one. 2022 has been a big year for ZMF. They first came out with the Atrium, which was just a fantastic sounding headphone. Then they came out with the new and improved Auteur Classic, which in my opinion is one of the best bang for the buck headphones on the market today. And then they follow it up with their very first planar magnetic headphone, the Caldera. So it has been one hit after the other for ZMF. And then coming up next year, we have the possibilities of the closed-back Caldera, which has already been confirmed that it's in the works by Zach, as well as the closed-back Atrium. So now whether those two headphones are both coming out next year or not, I'm not entirely sure. But that possibility does exist, that we could have two more new ZMFs in short order. The Caldera is a very balanced sounding headphone to my ears. ZMF neutral, if you will. Great texture, very punchy, nice liquid mid-range, and a very holographic 3D flowing head stage. When I used it with the transformer coupled amp, it imposed a lot more tube goodness into it, and it really almost sounded like a new dynamic driver headphone from ZMF. It really pushed it way over into the dynamic driver side of things. With the solid state Cayin amp, I was still getting that liquid mid-range, which quite possibly could be coming from my DAC, I don't know. But you still have that creaminess, that flowing quality in the mid-range, bookended by the planar bass and the planar highs, with the planar technicalities, the layering, the imaging. It is just a fantastic combination. And if you own other planar headphones, if you own the Susvara, the Abyss, any of them that I've heard, the Caldera sounds nothing like any of them. So it can easily coexist with other planar magnetic headphone that you happen to have in your collection currently. This headphone is not going to be redundant. It is a very unique sounding headphone, which is probably why there hasn't been too many reviews out on it yet, or thoughts on how it sounds, because it's kind of hard for me to wrap my brain around the various qualities that this headphone brings at you at the same time. I would like to thank ZMF for allowing me a first shot at listening to the Caldera. It's been an absolute pleasure. And once again, ZMF has produced yet another beautiful sounding, fantastic headphone. And the wait was definitely worth the Caldera. This has been Monster Zero, and I'll catch you guys again next time.